With the turn of the millennia meant new opportunities, and for Intelligent Systems, a lot of those opportunities came to light. The year was 2001. With the release of the Nintendo GameCube came a game everyone was stoked to play: Super Smash Bros. Melee. And within its roster, two characters that caught the attention of a lot of people: Marth and Roy. While this wasn't the first exposure of Fire Emblem in the Western market, it's the first time people really started to pay attention to it. So with interest in a previously unknown series on the rapid rise, Nintendo and Intelligent Systems decided to take a chance, and released their strategy series for the first time internationally, with its Game Boy Advance installment. That game, of course, being Advance Wars. Advance Wars was stupid successful. It was so well adapted into the North American market, someone at Nintendo of America then proceeded to ask Japan, "Hey, can we get Fire Emblem now?" Okay. With this possibility brought up, an executive decision was made. The newest Fire Emblem game developed would be the first game in the series to be released in North America and Europe. In Japan, it was called Fire Emblem Rekka no Ken, translated as Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade. However, to the rest of the world, this game would be known simply as Fire Emblem. Not only was this the first game in the Fire Emblem series to be released worldwide, it was also the first game in the series that I played. Not only is this significant by pure circumstance, it also means a lot to me. So that begs the question, where do we begin? I suppose we should start with a simple word. If you asked me to sum up the entire reason I love Fire Emblem 7 so much in one word, that word would be BALANCE! If you asked me to sum up the entire reason I love Fire Emblem 7 so much in one word, that word would be concise. Binding Blade and Blazing Blade are fundamentally the same game. Both play exactly the same, neither has any specific gameplay hooks the other doesn't. Theoretically, Fire Emblem 7 will excel and falter in the same ways that Fire Emblem 6 did. And yet, it doesn't. Take into consideration the things I said throughout this entire video series so far, and compare them to what I bring up now. You might notice that there are some subtle changes between these two entries that make huge differences. The map sizes were significantly smaller. This was the most notable difference made from any Fire Emblem that came before, and not one to be taken lightly. Smaller maps can be excavated faster, which in turn makes them more fun to play on. This also inadvertently buffed slower moving units, such as knights, as their slow speed was less of a penalty. Cavaliers and flyers were just a more potent option rather than a necessity. This makes more sense when you realize, oh yeah, duh, this is for the Game Boy Advance. It makes a lot more sense to make smaller maps for a system where you can't display a ton of information. It's one thing to say the map should be smaller to not overwhelm the stupid Americans, but the challenge that came with this is that Intelligent Systems needed to design maps that were still satisfying enough for competent Japanese players. Fire Emblem 7 brought back mission variety to the series. One map could be required to seize a point, another could have you defend someone from an onslaught of bandits, another could be to simply survive. Fire Emblem 7 was an example of using the limited space in a clever way, and even provided more for the players if they made the most of these maps. Side quests returned for this entry as well, but it finally gave players the choice of opting out if they wanted to. The story didn't have a true ending locked behind doing them, so there wasn't any pressure to move ahead if you wanted. But you'd probably be more willing to participate because you received that choice. You would get bonuses that would be of great assistance even if you didn't have access to them right away. At the very least, the only thing you would get is more experience for your units, which is always a plus in a game that doesn't allow for grinding. This was also the first game in the series to get rid of same-turn reinforcements. Any backup the enemy would receive would now come at the beginning of the player phase. It was now a surprise that you had a moment to plan for and deal with. A fair, strategic challenge. The playable cast was also reduced. The variety of team composition was admittedly lower than ever. However, the game made up for this by having characters being much more potent. Units came alongside generally higher growth rates, making them more likely to become good fighters. In previous games, there was nothing worse than units that didn't have the strength to go up against other enemies, even if you did invest time into them. Binding Blade struggled with this balance, especially when it came to boss fights. Thrones and gates reduced the defense and avoidance buffs they provided the units standing on top of them, and almost every weapon in the game increased the hit potential it provided. Enemy stats in general were much lower than Binding Blade. With this rebalancing, it felt like strategy was rewarded. Many of these changes were cited as issues that Fire Emblem's Japanese audience criticized about the game. Things that made it feel more hollow than the previous games in the series. That made it too easy. As a knee-jerk reaction, I can understand that. In an industry where a sequel is expected to be bigger and better, to see a game that reserves itself is pretty strange. While these changes were made intending for the series to be accessible for a Western audience, these are also just good ideas. Whether they did so intentionally or not, Team Emblem just created the most fast-paced and engaging game in the series. While undoubtedly easier than every single entry that came before, to the people just introduced to this game in the North American market, this game was praised for its difficulty. Sure, it was easier, but it was an engaging challenge. Missions take just the right amount of time that once I was done with one, I save the game, get thrust into the next scenario, and think, okay, maybe just one more. When playing Binding Blade again, I had to force myself to keep going. With Blazing Blade, I couldn't stop playing. But in all fairness, it should be stated that the moment-to-moment gameplay is not the only reason for this. Because despite the little improvements in the gameplay, it pales in comparison to the place where this game made its biggest strides. In its story! This is the most intimate and personal story the series has ever told. Fire Emblem stories can typically get described as an inspired youth has received a call to action, sets out with a small army to travel the entire continent and defeat an evil dragon. Maybe your dad dies along the way. They're still quite a bit similar to other games, but one of the more surprising aspects is that the characters don't travel the entire continent. This game only tells the story it needs. A royal isn't forced out of his home to reclaim the nation's hearts during war. This is about a boy who is worried about his father, which unexpectedly ties him into a conspiracy running far deeper than anyone imagined. We see a lot of the characters breaking from the traditional archetypes they've normally been categorized under. Eliwood would have probably been the same Lord stereotype we've expected most characters of the series to be, but having Hector and Lyn alongside them present a chemistry to the main cast that elevate them above the levels of intrigue they would have reached on their own. Even characters who would have barely had a moment on screen in previous games are able to let their stories shine. Fire Emblem 7 takes enough time to slow down and focus in on the characters, and even give them the opportunity to regroup when things go wrong. You can see the emotion on their faces. Character portraits blink now. Even if it's not the most original plot of its genre, Fire Emblem 7 excels in telling a story that's inspiring in a day where handhelds weren't capable of pre-rendered cutscenes and voice acting. Fire Emblem 7 is paced so well, I keep thinking the game is shorter than it actually is. If I gave more of a synopsis for the story, I wouldn't be sure where to stop. It all feels important to convey, but enough of a spoiler that it should be left for the experience. The beginning of the chapters do a great job setting up the battle to come, while many of the post-chapter conversations may discuss the character's next move or create mystery. All this positively affected by the sound engineers retooling the instrumentation for this game to make every song more impactful and alive, and oh man, I never wanted to give a hug to characters more than I do for the ones in this game! Naturally, as a prequel, it's not required you play Binding Blade before this game. There will be quite a few characters where upon meeting them it's like, oh hey, you're that guy! Perhaps you may even find characters that just look familiar, since they're probably a parent or a sibling or whatever to a character from that game. But the focus isn't on them, the focus is on the story they actually create for this new game, so it feels like it's appropriate to have those callouts because it's not being forced in. And there are some moments in this game that will give explanations to events players were told about in Binding Blade. But here's the great thing, knowledge of the events of Binding Blade aren't required to understand the context for these scenes. In the last game, we were told that ChrisTheFields wasn't always a bad person, and he really tried to impress his father and be a good big brother to his younger sister, and that holds true in this game. You actually can feel kinda bad for ChrisTheFields, especially if you didn't know he was the antagonist of the previous game. It should also be noted that Eliwood's story is not the only one in the game. Of the 32 required chapters, only about 20 of them are effectively the main story. 2 other campaigns were in this game to really give you the bang for your bottom dollar. After completing the game for the first time, you got access to Hector's story. One might assume at first glance that this is just an alternate perspective of Eliwood's story, and that's really only half true. Hector mode includes a few new chapters, a slightly harder difficulty, new music, and a character subplot involving his brother Uther you wouldn't know about by playing the main game. I must confess that even to this day I still never finished Hector mode fully, but
I'm playing through like 20 Fire Emblem games right now, give me a break.
The other of the 2 campaigns feature Lyn, taking place 1 year before the events of the actual story.
Lin's story was a way to introduce you to the characters you would meet throughout the game, as well as allude to what you would be going up against in Eliwood's campaign. But with all these stories, what's the connecting piece between them all? Well, you. Before there was Corrin, or Robin, or Chris, it was Mark from Fire Emblem 7, the first use of a player avatar in the series. On a surface level, it didn't seem that well thought out as a concept. The creation screen was nothing more than a few options. But it's ironically not here for you to be involved in the story, but to contextualize your mechanical role in it. You're not Eliwood, or Lyn, or Hector. You're the tactician that gives the orders to everyone. Your priorities shouldn't be favoring the characters just because they're the main cast, but to make wise decisions that will benefit the army as a whole. Characters calling directly to the player might have been seen as a jarring fourth wall break to some, but I think it's to continually establish, hey, you're not me. And that goes a long way in setting up exactly what you need to do in order to get into the mindset properly. But thankfully, that wasn't the only way the game did that for you.
When I started the Fire Emblem Retrospective early last year, I asked if certain games we would be covering would be suitable starting points for newcomers to the series. As time went on, I sort of just phased that segment of the video out because I thought it could be just its own separate video at another point. But let's bring it back for this game specifically. If you've never played a Fire Emblem game before in your life, would 7 be a suitable starting point for you as a player? Yes! Yes, like holy crap! This game should be your first priority if you've never played a Fire Emblem in your life! I blew up there. I apologize.
Lyn's campaign wasn't just a prologue. It was an extensive tutorial that would see it you knew everything you needed before starting the game prim and proper. Fire Emblem is a pretty tame series in comparison to many other strategy games, but make no mistake, it's certainly not easy to just pick up and go. So in assurance that no player was left behind, Lyn was there to slowly guide you through the basics as they came up, and with each new chapter, built upon those establishments. The first chapter just has you controlling Lyn. It teaches you how to direct units and how to combat enemies, while healing yourself when your life gets low. The second chapter introduces more characters to control. It adds terrain that can make you more evasive, trading items between units, and the weapons triangle to improve chances of striking. The third chapter teaches you about collecting information, breaking cracked walls, and impassable terrain. The fourth chapter goes over visiting villages, attack ranges of archers, weapon effectiveness, and what permanent death is like because Florina sucks! The fifth chapter is all about defending, introducing a new mission objective and recruiting enemy units. I could go far beyond the length of this video explaining all the things the tutorial teaches the player, but there are some valid reasons why people would inevitably be annoyed by this approach. It's incredibly hand-holding, forcing lessons down your throat whether you want to engage or not. But there are two claims I have against this though. I think that it is very valuable this game teaches you by actually making you. Yeah, not being allowed to move on until the game lets you is kind of annoying, but by forcing you to take those actions, it's less likely you'll forget what to do when you need to do them later. And you'll absolutely need to know how to do them later. The second point is, you're playing an RPG, people, have some patience! Every game in the series is at least good, but Fire Emblem 7 wasn't just good. It was so darn amazing that the reality of human life we knew was shattered as we needed to redefine what a good game truly was. Understatements aside, making a smaller game really set this apart from the other Fire Emblems, while still following under the same umbrella. Its great story kept me invested throughout the whole journey, with game design that isn't overbearing while still being sufficiently challenging. I had a ton of fun playing this game again. It's still one of, if not the best Fire Emblem game to date. Intelligent Systems learned a lot from this game, and that would actually carry over into the other Fire Emblems that would be made from now on. While Binding Blade was the foundation for the Fire Emblem series and laid a lot of the groundwork, Blazing Blade is the game that built on that groundwork, and is the reason that the rest of the Fire Emblem series is as good as it is. I enjoyed the games in the series leading up to this moment, but ladies and gentlemen, we are just getting started.
With development of Fire Emblem 7 concluded, Team Emblem went hard to work for the next big step of the series. This time, the first console title seen since the Super Famicom. So naturally, the next time Fire Emblem would be put into players' hands, it was as a handheld title for the Game Boy Advance. Wait, what the frick?